So the nervous system lecture includes, moving your body parts and stuff, which of course the nervous system does, but also the activities of the brain, behavioral health, some of the, Alzheimer disease and things that go wrong with your brain, because it's all part of the nervous system. So it covers quite a bit of territory. We have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The nervous system is one of your two main control mechanisms for the body. We're doing both of those today. The nervous system sends out signals down an axon and releases from the axon terminal a neurotransmitter that binds to receptors on the receiving cells and turns them on or off. So you're able to send bigger, smaller signals, more intense, less intense, a lot of control. And these axons, especially in the central nervous system in the brain, you'll have a single axon which takes the signal from the cell, and it will split out into sometimes hundreds of axon terminals, and a lot of them will turn on other nerves. So nerves affecting nerves, making nerves more or less active. And so there's really a lot of crossover in how that works. If we're talking about skeletal muscle, it just turns on that skeletal muscle cell and the muscle contracts. But it can be more complicated than that. And the second system is the endocrine system, the hormones. So whereas the nervous system has a more direct effect on target cells, the hormone system or endocrine system releases similar signaling molecules into the bloodstream, and it goes and turns on whatever cells happen to have a receptor for that particular substance. And so you have the hormonal system and nervous system working together to make sure we maintain, normal body temperatures, normal blood pressures, normal amounts of calcium in the blood. Everything is maintained by these two systems. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. It's wrapped in a sheath made out of meninges. So if you have meningitis, that's the lining that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. It's filled with cerebrospinal fluid, not blood. It's clear, a clear fluid. And, if you do a spinal tap, you're taking that out. And if it's not clear, you have an infection, that kind of thing. So you have the nerves that originate somewhere in the brain, either up in the cortex where you have your voluntary thought processes and stuff. If I want to move my leg, I'm going to start the signal there because I know that I want to move my leg. It sends the signal down, goes down a certain distance, generally crosses over to the other side, and goes down the spinal cord and exits wherever it needs to turn something on. So if I bash my head over here, I get paralyzed over here. It's called contralateral. If I bash my head up here, I might be paralyzed here because that's before it crosses over. That's called ipsilateral. So damage here will affect the face on the same side, but the arm on the other side because you have this crossover. The initial nerve that comes out of the brain is called the first order nerve. And then when it turns on a second nerve that goes out to a tissue, that's called the second order nerve. Or sometimes the upper nerve and the lower nerve. Most of these nerves have signals going both ways. So you'll have your receptors out here sending signals back so you have sensation. And afferent or input signals. A becomes before E. You feel it, then you do something about it. Efferent or efferent is the motor nerve that comes back in the other direction. The receptors are up here and the axon terminals are down there. So it's like a telephone line. You've got, talk going both ways through these nerves to sense things that throughout the body and then turn things on. Anything that is outside the spinal cord and brain is a peripheral nerve. It's either in the central nervous system or it's not. So central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, nerves, once they have left either the brain, called cranial nerves, or the spine, called spinal nerves, those are peripheral nerves then. And they take the signal to the target tissues. So the brain stem, the spinal cord, at the bottom of the nerves, instead of staying within a single sheath, they kind of spread out as they get ready to go down the sciatic nerve and the femoral nerve and other nerves and stuff. This area looks like a horse's tail. It's called the cauda equina. And this is the area where you take a spinal tap from, because you can go between the nerves without stabbing a nerve to get out some cerebrospinal fluid. Communication designed to detect changes. You have receptors on the inside that tell you if your blood pressure is right, your temperature is right, the osmolarity of your blood, that means how much stuff there is in it, how concentrated it is, whether you have enough sodium, whether you have enough this, whether you have enough that. You know, it detects whether you're moving or not. You have sensors that come back from your joints and say, I'm moving, let's start breathing faster. And so when you first start moving, your breath rate will accelerate, your heart rate will accelerate, even though you haven't moved enough to actually need more oxygen yet. So you have inputs that tell you what's going on so that you can output appropriately. And then you have external, exteroreceptors too, that tell you how hot or cold it is, whether you're being stabbed or, you know, beaten or something from the outside, for pain receptors and stuff. So you have external sensory information too, obviously from the eyes and ears and taste buds and stuff as well. And then, of course, especially for us, we have emotions, thought processes, and things that are most specifically to the cortex of the cerebrum, the big, all wavy part of your brain that is so complicated in humans. The cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain. It contains the cerebral cortex, which has all the nerve bodies in them, the cell bodies. That's gray matter. Go inside, and all the white matter are axons that are now taking the signals from one cell across to somewhere else. There are ventricles within the brain that contain cerebrospinal fluid. They make the cerebrospinal fluid. They have cells that secrete it all the time. It goes through little tubes and pathways. It goes around the brain. It goes down the spinal cord, and then gets absorbed by some other cells that are designed to absorb it. So you are constantly making fresh cerebrospinal fluid and then absorbing it at the same rate so the pressure doesn't go up. And these ventricles are storage places for the cerebrospinal fluid that's being made. You have the lateral ventricles, which you could say are ventricles 1 and 2, and then you have ventricle 3 and ventricle 4, the third and fourth ventricles, which, you know, are a little bit farther down, and it provides this circulatory pattern of cerebrospinal fluid all through the central nervous system within the meninges that are containing all of this. The cerebellum, that thing we saw sticking out on the cranioschissus picture, the cerebellum is back here. It's actually a different kind of material. It's, you know, the midbrain is up in here. It has some various structures that include areas that are designated for your level of awakeness, whether you're conscious or unconscious, your emotions, whether you're feeling hatred or love or fear. Some of those are contained in small little blobs of cells throughout the brain here called nuclei, like the nucleus of a cell. But if you have a blob of cells within the brain somewhere, not in the cortex, it's called a nucleus. So we have this and that nucleus that have those other functions, and that's in the midbrain area here. The brain stem is the pons and medulla oblongata. That, we're going to talk about them some more. The cerebellum is a very primitive brain. It has a lot to do with learned movements that you don't have to think about anymore, like walking, and it receives sensory information from your muscle spindle fibers that tell you what's going on in the muscle, so that you know how hard to push against the ground when you're walking or jumping, or tells you where your body is in space. Cerebellum, underneath, coordination, skeletal muscles, maintain balance, and learned activities. The brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord, and all of this stuff is inside the skull. Only the spinal cord should stick out. The midbrain, the brain stem, cerebellum, and everything is contained within the skull. So the skull is coming right here, okay? And so you have the cerebrum with the cerebral cortex, and you have the cerebellum, and you have the brain stem through here, and then the spinal cord is sticking out down there. Here it shows the flow pattern of the cerebrospinal fluid coming out of the ventricles. Pons and medulla oblongata. The pons, the term pons means bridge. It's the upper part of the brain stem and connects with the cerebellum. So the information going to and from the cerebellum up to your cortex goes through the pons to get there. Medulla oblongata is the lowest part, and it's the truly most primitive part. It controls how fast your heart beats and how fast you breathe and things like that. You can destroy the cerebrum and be in a persistent vegetative state and still lie there and breathe. So that is a possibility. You can destroy what makes you the person you are, and still the brainstem might keep you theoretically alive. Spinal cord then goes all the way through each vertebrae. It has the vertebral arch that provides some protection for the spinal cord, going down between each or through each one all the way to the cauda equina at the bottom. And the spinal cord has what are called spinal tracts that take specific information. They'll have the motor nerves going through them that run your arms and legs. They'll have some autonomic fibers going through that will control your, some of your other involuntary type functions. They have a separate tract just for proprioception that can tell you where your body is, where your hand is, even though you're not looking at it. And if you learn the spinal cord really well, you can say, well, if I damage that tract, exactly this won't happen. One good thing to remember about the spinal cord, though, is that if I damage the spinal cord here, everything above it will still work because it's still attached to your brain. Everything below it won't. So learning where, if I cut the spinal cord here in a motorcycle accident, I can't do this stuff. If I cut it here, I can't do that stuff. It's a slightly different amount of stuff. And of course, the higher you cut it, the more stuff you can't do, because all the spinal nerves and stuff below that point will be inactive. The meninges are the layers covering the entire thing. On the outside, you have a really tough, leathery material called the dura mater. It means durable. Within that, there's a layer that has a whole bunch of spidery-like little feet sticking down into the cerebrospinal fluid, and they interact with the cerebrospinal fluid and absorb excess cerebrospinal fluid. So it's coming out of the ventricles, being absorbed in the arachnoid mater. And the pia mater is a little saran wrap, clear layer that actually is attached to the brain surface. So you have the dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. You can have a subdural hematoma that's right below the dural layer, dura mater. You can have a subarachnoid hematoma. It's below the spider layer. And so those terms will make sense. Here's the meninges, the dura mater, arachnoid mater. The pia mater is actually stuck onto the tissue itself. Here we have the gray matter, tracts going up and down, and at every vertebrae, some nerves will exit. The ones that have to operate stuff right there will exit at that level. And they come out as nerve roots, and then they form, they synapse or turn on other nerves in these little blob areas called ganglia, because the first order nerve has to turn on the second order nerve, and those cell bodies make a blob there. So you have a root coming into the ganglia, and then a nerve goes out and turns on your leg or whatever. The peripheral nerves are cranial nerves and spinal nerves. 12 pairs of nerves leave the brain and never enter the spinal cord. Your optic nerves, of course, they don't have to go to your spine and come back up. Your olfactory for smell, your taste, your hearing. A lot of nerves are able to just go right where they need to go and not go in the spinal cord first. So if you break the spinal cord, those guys will still work because they never got in the spinal cord in the first place. One pair that is remarkably important for medicine are the vagus nerves. Cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerves, are the only ones that really go a long way away from the brain, and they control your entire chest and abdominal region. They slow down your heart. It's a parasympathetic nerve, so it slows things down. So it slows down your heart rate. It stimulates the GI tract. It's all the rest and digest stuff. Controls how dilated your bronchioles are in your lungs. And so the vagus nerves are remarkably important for controlling all of your viscera. Then you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that go down the spinal cord a certain distance and then leave. We have glial cells, which literally means glue, and these little cells hold all of the other nerve processes in their right place. So if you have nerve cells that have to interact exactly with each other, they'll probably be held together by a couple of different kinds of cells. You can have astrocytes, they look like stars. Oligodendrocytes not only send out a little foot, but they wrap around the axon of the other cell and myelinate it and make it work better. And these glial cells, you can have a glioma. You can have an astrocytoma, because there are different kinds of cells. Any of them can become cancerous and go out of control. Here are the cranial nerves. You don't need to memorize them for this class. You do for A and P1, but our facial nerve controls taste and all of our facial expressions. The optic nerve brings the signal back from the eye, and then you have 3 nerves that control eye tracking and eye movement. We're mostly visual creatures, like wolves and lions. Our main sense is vision. Olfactory is for smell. The trigeminal nerve works with some muscles here and are for chewing. Hypoglossal, remember glosso means under the tongue, or means tongue. So the hypoglossal nerve helps control tongue motion. Vagus nerves go into the lungs, the heart, the stomach, the liver, the intestines, all the way down there. Vestibulocochlear nerve, remember the vestibule is for balance, and cochleas for hearing. So these are ones that leave the brain and don't go down the spinal cord. In the peripheral nervous system, then you're taking the signal from that first order nerve and going out and turning on a tissue. One interesting thing about peripheral nerves is they're a little bit different from central nerves in that if you cut a central nerve, it cannot reattach. And so at least now we have no idea how to fix a broken spinal cord. You can sew the nerves right together, but the internal part of the nerve won't find each other, and you'll still be paralyzed from that point down. But peripheral nerves, if you reattach them properly, the inner workings will relocate each other, and you can make your arm work again, or your hand. Again, when I was growing up, they didn't know how to do that, and if somebody cut their arm off, you never bothered to try to put it back on. It'd be just like carrying around 10 pounds of hamburger hanging from the end of your arm because there was no recovery at all. But now, within a couple of hours, they can put it back on, and the person will gain most function back of their hand, even sensation. Sometimes it takes a few years for it to completely come back. Okay. So, some combining forms: cerebello-cerebro for the cerebellum and cerebrum, duro for the dura mater. Encephalo means brain. Okay, encephalo means brain. The ganglio or gangliono is for the ganglion, where the first order nerve turns on a bunch of second order nerves and you have a blob there. Glio is for the glial cells. Meningeo is for the meninges. So you can have a meningioma, or you can have meningitis. Myelo. Remember where we saw myelo before? Bone marrow, meaning the middle of. So here, you just got to know what system you're talking about, because we're going to have myelo here for the spinal cord as well. Neuro for nerve. And here we have the spinal cord is important enough, we have to have multiple names for it. Like we do histero and metrio, and like we have, whatever. So we have radico, we have radiculo, and rhizo, all are nerve root terms. Nerve roots. The tree rises from its roots, right? That's a radical idea. Esthesio is a term that means sensation. Okay? And it sounds like, the asthenia almost, which means strength. Remember, myasthenia means a loss of muscle strength. Okay? Esthesia, though, means sensation. So an anesthetic takes away sensation. It makes you numb, or it makes you fall asleep, or whatever. So anesthesia. Mento and psycho both mean your mind. Mono means one. Phaso means speech. Phono means talking, making noise also. But speech isn't exactly the same, because if you have aphasia, you may not understand speech either. So it can be receptive or expressive problems with the understanding or the use of speech. And you have speech centers in your brain that control that. Polio means gray matter. So the disease polio, the term is actually poliomyelitis. Gray matter of the spinal cord, inflammation. Poliomyelitis is the name for that disease. And this simply refers to the gray matter. Quadra is 4, like if you're a quadriplegic. Remember, iatro means the doctor or the, physician, whatever. So an iatrist is a physician, a psychiatrist. Iatry, psychiatry, is the specialty. Ictal is a weird term meaning seizure. So if you have epilepsy, you have a pre-ictal phase, you have the ictal phase, and then you have post-ictal stupor, where you just lie there after the seizure's over. Paresis is a term meaning partial paralysis. So you can be a quadriplegic if you can't do anything with your arms and legs, but quadriparesis would mean it's partially numb, partial inability to move. Myelo, spinal cord, paresis and plegia, some paralysis, total paralysis. Slight paralysis, esis. So, a lot of these are going to make sense. Cerebellitis, of course, inflammation of the cerebellum. Cerebral thrombosis, bad condition, a blood clot in the brain. Cerebral thrombosis. It might cause a stroke. It wouldn't necessarily have to. You might have a blood clot that's in a place that isn't bad enough that it actually causes a stroke. But that's one likely cause of a stroke. Duritis, inflammation of the dura mater. Encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. Encephalomalacia, softening, dissolving of the brain. Encephalomyeloradiculitis, the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerve roots. The ganglia, a glioblastoma. Blastoma, remember the retinoblastoma was a cancerous tumor of the retinal material. This is of the glial tissue, glial cells. Glioma is just a tumor. It might not be cancerous. Meningioma comes from the meninges, the layer. Meningitis, meningocele, that makes sense. Meningomyelocele. This is the meninges of the spinal cord bulging out, also known as spina bifida. Mononeuropathy, a problem, a disease in a single nerve. Polyneuropathy would be lots of them. Neuralgia, nerve pain. Everybody's had neuralgia. Sometimes when you get a cold or you have something and like your skin hurts. It's like, if when you rub it, it actually hurts. Myelomeningocele. Neuritis, nerve inflammation. Neuroarthropathy, the nerves of the joint are diseased. Neuroma, tumor, disease. Poliomyelitis, the gray matter of the spinal cord is inflamed. Polyneuritis, lots of nerves. Polyneuropathy. Radiculitis is ridiculous, it's the nerve roots. Rhizomeningomyelitis. What's rhizo? Another term for nerve roots. And the meninges of the nerve roots of the spinal cord is inflamed. Yikes. Subdural hematoma. This is a blood tumor. In other words, a bleed causing a blob of blood right below the dura. And then here are some other diseases, most of what you've heard of. Alzheimer, which is a progressive production of plaques within the brain tissue that block the ability of the nerves to interact with each other, ultimately causing the nerves to die, and the brain kind of shrinks and becomes less and less effective till the person becomes totally demented and winds up dying. You know, sometimes they die because they don't remember to eat and they starve themselves to death, but other times you can't live without a brain. And so if it's a progressive Alzheimer, it's lethal. Here's Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Again, you have a plaque hardening of the muscle, you know, and the muscle turning on process, and the muscles shrink away, and the person becomes like that, like Stephen Hawking, who now he can't speak. He's still, your brain is absolutely, completely intact. You're as smart and funny and everything as you ever were, but you can't talk and you can't move. Bell palsy, if you have damage to a nerve, or maybe it could be potentially from a neuropathy from diabetes, or it can be from a stroke or damage to a nerve on one side, causing that side of your face to sag. A cerebral aneurysm is a weak, bulging blood vessel inside the brain. They cause a lot of deaths because when they pop, you tend to bleed to death or, have loss of brain function. Cerebral embolism is a blob of something that came from somewhere else and is lodged in a blood vessel in your brain. So these cause your two kinds of stroke, a bleeding stroke or a thrombotic stroke, where you have blocked a blood vessel. Cerebral palsy is it's a paralysis and lack of control of your muscles due to it's not a birth defect. It's actually not really clear what causes cerebral palsy, but kids are born with the inability to communicate properly and move properly. Sometimes they're wheelchair bound, depends on how bad it is. Some cerebral palsy can be caused by having an umbilical cord wrapped around his neck and not having sufficient oxygen at the time of birth, but a lot of them don't have any real known cause.
I had a brother with cerebral palsy growing up, and they had told my mother that they thought that it was caused from her getting cytomegalovirus during a specific trimester of her pregnancy.
That's a possibility.
That's what they assumed.
Right, yeah. But again, if you look up the causes of cerebral palsy, there's a lot of postulation of things that could have possibly gone wrong, but there's no list of things that cause cerebral palsy, except for the umbilical cord around the neck actually causing hypoxia during some part of the childbirth. Dementia is a cognitive impairment, the inability to understand what's going on or make sense of what's going on. It could be due to cerebral palsy that causes enough brain damage in some way. It could be because of Alzheimer. It could be because of several different kinds of things. But the term dementia just means you have lost the ability to understand and make sense of things. Epilepsy, interesting. Epilepsy is kind of like cerebral palsy. A seizure is an uncontrolled firing of neurons in your brain that makes you go. It can make you fall unconscious. It can make you, go into, contractions and whatnot. But epilepsy is the term for any of them if you can't actually figure out the cause of it. It can be caused by a fever. Kids have seizures because their fever gets too high. Okay, that's not epilepsy. Okay, it can be caused by, this problem or that problem, an actual documented disease. But if it's not, it's epilepsy. Hydrocephalus, excess water on the brain, often caused by a blockage of the pathway of all of the cerebrospinal fluid so that it can't exit. Kind of like glaucoma. Your eye gets too much pressure in it. Your head gets extra pressure. Hydrocephaly as an adult it's pretty quickly lethal because you have nowhere for the pressure to go. Your skull case is fused and it won't stretch. In an infant, when the bones aren't connected yet, the head just gets bigger and bigger. And for a little while, it doesn't allow the pressure to go up high enough to kill the child or even cause serious brain damage at first. If it goes on very long, it causes brain damage anyway, but still, if you solve the problem, you might be able to save the kid's life. Bell palsy, a loss of nerve stimulation on that side. What could you also call this? What's eyelid? Blepharoptosis. Blepharoptosis. A couple of different kinds of dementia. Alzheimer. Multiple infarct dementia. Lots of mini strokes that make you finally have enough brain dysfunction that you're not making sense anymore. An infection of the central nervous system, a meningitis can make you go at least temporarily demented. Lewy body dementia. It's not the same kind of plaque that is formed with Alzheimer. It's a different plaque or blobs of proteins that show up within the brain tissue and disrupt brain function and cause dementia and ultimately death. And it actually progresses faster than Alzheimer does. Lewy body dementia is what Robin Williams was found to have had. And he obviously knew of the diagnosis, and when he decided to commit suicide, I think he just decided he didn't want to go through the dementia and forgetting who he was, and it's like, I don't want to do that. And so, really, really sad. Parkinson is a disease of some of those nuclei in the middle of the brain. It's an inability to process dopamine correctly. And what it causes is rigidity and tremor. And a hypokinesia, slow movement, a difficulty starting movement and stopping movement. It also tends to be a progressive disease. Wernicke-Korsakoff is a disease of some of the processing areas of the brain, including the areas that are speech related. B1 deficiency can cause it. Also, alcoholism has been associated with Wernicke-Korsakoff. Hydrocephalus is too much water in there. Well, there's one way of having too much water, and that is if you make it or can't drain it and the pressure goes up. But another can be that if the brain is shrinking, the ventricles get bigger, and there's extra water in there, even though the pressure is not bigger. It's just taking up the extra space. But it would be a dementia situation because you're losing brain matter, making room for this extra fluid. Intercerebral hemorrhage would be inside the brain. Multiple sclerosis. We looked this up, and there are sclerotic hard patches that form on the nerves and in the brain, and it interrupts. It's a demyelinating disease. A nerve that is supposed to move really fast has a sheath around it called a myelin sheath, and it causes this signal to move 10 times faster than it does if it's not myelinated. Multiple sclerosis is one demyelinating disease that affects those myelinating cells that cause the extra speed of that transmission. And as they die and deteriorate, they form scar tissue or sclerotic plaques along the nerves. And so, thus the name multiple sclerosis. This is another disease. We don't know why it happens. We don't know what's causing it. We can see that it's happening, but we don't, have a switch that we can turn it off yet. Parkinson. Sciatica is an inflammation of the sciatic nerve, your main nerve that goes down the back of your leg that controls your hamstring muscles and calf muscles. Shingles, the herpes zoster virus. You get herpes zoster from chicken pox, and after your chicken pox is over, the herpes virus hides in your nerves for years and years and years until it suddenly decides to explode forth, causing a huge inflammation of the nerves and excruciating pain. A stroke is any blockage to the brain. Subarachnoid hemorrhage is right below the little spidery layer of the meninges. A TIA is a transient ischemic attack. People will suddenly lose their ability to speak or pay attention, and they'll kind of be in a bit of a frozen state, and then they'll kind of wake up from it. These are predictive of having real strokes later, but they're not real strokes. A TIA is some kind of a contraction of blood vessels that then relaxes and restores blood flow to your brain. Hemorrhagic stroke and ischemic or thrombotic stroke. It can be a blood clot, it can be a little piece of plaque that broke off from somewhere else, an embolus that comes and blocks it. What you have to be careful is you have to be sure you know which kind it is before you treat the person. Because if you give them a clot buster, it thins the blood, and if they're already bleeding, it can kill them. Most strokes are of the thrombotic kind, but you have to be sure that it's not a hemorrhagic stroke. And you can tell by doing a CT scan, because remember, blood glows under the CT scan. And so if you see a big shiny area in there, you don't give them a clot buster. Shingles often follows the route of a nerve. In this case, it looks like it's coming out multiple places, but a lot of times it's a stripe right along a nerve root or a spinal nerve. A blood clot or atherosclerotic plaque that lodges in a cerebral artery is called, it's come from somewhere else. It's lodging in a cerebral artery. So which one is it? Embolism. A thrombosis is a locally produced blood clot. If this breaks loose and goes somewhere else and blocks something, it's an embolism. Surgical terms. Ganglionectomy, removing a ganglion. Neurectomy, removing a nerve. Neurolysis, just breaking apart, dissolving, falling apart. Neuroplasty, neuroraphy. All this makes sense now. Neurotomy, cutting into it. Radicotomy, rhizotomy, cutting into the nerve root. Rhizotomy, radicotomy, and sometimes if there's nothing you can do to stop the monster pain, you might just snip the sensory nerve. You would never snip the motor nerve because then you couldn't move your leg. But it's, a radical treatment would be, it would leave you numb somewhere, but it might alleviate pain enough that you could get on with your life.
So those are specific to the dorsal root?
Yeah, the dorsal root, yeah. And so you should be able not to make the mistake and snip the wrong one, because you have sensory and motor coming in two different sets of roots. Diagnostic terms: cerebral angiography, you'd be looking at what? Blood vessels in the brain. Myelography, spinal cord. Electroencephalogram, looking at the electrical activity of the brain. You put several electrodes on it, and you lie there and you watch and see what the brain waves look like. Process of recording CT myeloid. The process would be what? Graphy. Diagnostic imaging, CT scan. They use a lot of CT scans. It picks up subdural bleeds, hematomas, and intracranial bleeds, and all kinds of stuff like that. MRIs are even more definitive. They're slower, more expensive. You know, I mean, if somebody comes in and they whack their head, they almost always just put them through a CT scanner to see if there's anything obvious right away. PET scan, you're looking at contrast. You can use a contrast CT scan too, where you inject a contrast medium so that it shows up more vividly on the CT scanner. Evoked potential studies. Evoked potentials are, an action potential is a nerve firing. An evoked potential is firing not because it's stimulated by something within the body, but because it's stimulated by photons hitting your rods and cones, or because your eardrum is vibrating. So evoked potentials are sight and sound studies. A lumbar puncture, that's sticking a needle in there to take some cerebrospinal fluid out. See, it's down in the cauda equina region, so they can go in without actually poking a hole in a nerve. So, anesthesia, no feeling, no sensation. Aphasia, lack of speech. If you get hit in your speech center, you have a speech center up here called Broca's area that allows you to form the words muscularly. Back here is the area that allows you to understand speech. So there are a couple of reasons for aphasia. If you get a lesion here or a tumor here or something and it destroys Broca's area, you can still write, you can still use sign language. You just can't form the words with your mouth. If you lose this, you can't form the words in your brain. You don't know what a word is. I mean, you remember what it might have been like to communicate, but you can't communicate anymore by sign language, by writing, or anything, because speech no longer makes sense to you. Much worse. Cephalalgia, pain in the brain, headache. Cerebral, craniocerebral, talking about the skull and the head. Dysphagia, an inability to speak properly. A lot of people who have a stroke, they can still kind of talk, but it's really hard. And they get better, a lot of them, because those specific neurons don't regenerate, but they learn to use other neurons to provide some of the same pathways that they lost. Encephalosclerosis, hardening of the brain. A gliocyte is a glial cell. Hemiparesis means loss of some sensation on one side. So if you get whacked over here and you're not paralyzed over here, you're likely to be, somewhat deficient on that side. Hemiplegia, paralysis on one side. Hyperesthesia means burning, tingling, extra sensation. Like neuralgia produces a hyperesthesia. Like, wow, it hurts to even touch my face. Interictal is the time between seizures. So you have an interictal phase, and before you have the next seizure, you have an interictal phase. Intracerebral means inside the head. Mental, referring to your mind. Monoparesis, one limb. Monoplegia, one limb. Quadriplegia is all four of them. Myelomalacia, softening of the spinal cord, not the bones necessarily. Neuroid, a neuroid tumor looks like a nerve. Neurologist. Panplegia, that's worse than quadriplegia. You can't even move your mouth. You can't do anything. If your stroke was so bad you have no ability to move anything. Or your head being run over by a truck. Paresthesia, unusual sensation. It may not be really strong, but it feels different than it should. Oh, that feels really weird. Postictal, right after a seizure. Preictal is right before it. Epilepsy, sometimes people have a preictal aura or something. They feel like they're about to have a seizure. Quadriplegia, all four. Subdural, right below the dural layer. Take a short break and stretch a little bit. Quite a few more terms to go yet. I ain't perfect, but could have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot worse. Okay, not built from word parts. Afferent or afferent means incoming sensory nerves. Efferent or efferent means outgoing motor nerves. Ataxia is an abnormal gait. So if somebody had a stroke or if they had cerebral palsy and they have one of the kind of shuffling or abnormal gaits, they have an ataxic gait. Cognitive is the ability to think, your cognitive abilities. A coma is when you are unable to relate around you. You can be in a partial coma or a complete coma or deep coma, and you can actually be awake, but totally unconscious. It's hard. You have the level of arousal. You could be in a vegetative state where you don't relate to anything that's going on around you, but you appear awake anyway. So there are different types of coma. Concussion is a blow to the brain causing different levels of dysfunction. A mild concussion, you can just be dizzy for a few minutes and kind of say, whoa, man, what happened? In football, it happens all the time. They run to the sideline, they come back in, where they're not supposed to, but they do anyway. A deeper concussion leaves you actually lose track of what went on for a certain amount of time, and usually there are follow-up effects too. You might have some memory loss, some headaches, and things that would follow it up. Conscious is your level of being able to understand. Being awake and being conscious are actually two different things. You can't be conscious if you're not awake, but you can be awake and not be conscious. You can be, but not be able to tell what's going on. A convulsion sometimes accompanies a seizure. That's when there's muscle activity. It can be a rigid muscle activity or a quivering muscle activity. So some epileptic seizures involve convulsions, others may not. The person may just kind of lie there for a little while. Disorientation, you kind of can't figure out what's going on. Dementia causes disorientation. Concussions cause at least temporary disorientation. Dysarthria, a loss of muscle tone that is making speech hard. This sounds like it should have something to do with joints, but remember, these are not built from word parts. It's just a term that, like with myasthenia gravis, you might lose the ability to work your muscles very well, and it causes partial or total loss of speech. The gait is the way you walk. If you're incoherent, you can't be understood. If you have your motor area of speech, but you've lost your speech back here, some people will babble, but it sounds like a baby talking. They're trying to communicate, but they can't actually form words, even in their own mind. A paraplegic is paralyzed from the waist down. Paraparesis means you've lost some ability from the waist down. A seizure we talked about. And then a shunt is a tube that you put in to usually relieve pressure to let fluid go out. You can put a shunt from your brain actually down inside and down into your abdominal cavity so excess fluid has a place to drain. Syncope means fainting. That's one you ought to learn because a lot of people have syncope. You can have syncope from being too scared. You can have syncope from standing up too fast and having all the blood drain out of your head. You can have syncope from being overheated, unconsciousness, inability to actually perceive what's going on around you. Types of paralysis. What is one full side? Hemiparesis, hemiplegia. What is just the legs? Paraplegia. All four? Quadriplegia. Everything? Panplegia. What's that? Uh-huh. And mono. There's actually a term, if your one arm is paralyzed, you probably didn't damage your spinal cord, you probably damaged nerves that lead to the arm in the brachial plexus. Behavioral health terms. A psychiatrist practices psychiatry. Psychogenic means it was created in your mind. A psychogenic, problem could be something like, a phobia is psychogenic problem that you have. There are psychogenic diseases where people think they're sick when they're really not. More often they really are sick, but they don't know what it is, so they say it must be all in your mind. But the term means it's coming from your brain. A psychologist and a psychiatrist are not the same. A psychologist is a studier of psychology and someone who can help you relate better with things going on in your life. The psychiatrist is a medical doctor that can prescribe drugs and do surgeries perhaps and whatnot. Psychopathy, a disease of the mind. Psychosis, an abnormal condition of the mind. It could be caused by one of the dementias or by, schizophrenia. Psychosomatic, illness of the body that is psychic in general. So a psychosomatic illness is kind of like psychogenic. Anorexia nervosa, we talked about. Anxiety disorder, you're just, concerned and scared and all the time. It can be a result of life, things, or it can be psychogenic. People can just be more anxious than they need to be. Attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. They added the hyperactivity because people who have the inability to focus on something are constantly moving on to something else. And so the most disruptive part of a kid having ADHD is their hyperactivity. They can't sit still and concentrate on something for any amount of time. Autism, a very poorly understood condition where the child can't relate well, or the person, to their surroundings. And one of the biggest problems with autism is they can't filter out the things that they don't need to concentrate on right now. So the sound of the air conditioner is just as important to them as the sound of my voice. A dropping of a pencil could sound like an explosion. They can't concentrate, and it's not ADHD, it's an inability simply to focus your brain on the things that matter the most. Sometimes autistic kids can have extremely high function in a particular area of their brain that really does work right, and they become a savant of some kind where they can, like Rain Man, they can drop a bunch of matchsticks on the floor and they can just look at them and tell how many there are, and things like that. Bulimia, binge and purge. Major depression, a serious condition, leads to suicidal thoughts. People feel like everything is going wrong, nothing can possibly get better. And the problem with depression is that you can't relate to the fact that doing something might make anything better. I mean, why don't you just try? Because I'm so depressed that couldn't possibly work. It wouldn't make me feel better to do that. Obsessive compulsive disorder, washing hands, ridiculous amount of times, counting your steps. my first psychiatry class or psychology class I had a long time ago, and the professor said, you know, I always count my steps, and said I lost track. I had to go home and start over again. You know, he didn't, but he was trying to make a point. A panic attack is when you suddenly believe things are about to become lethal or whatever, and you go through a whole fight or flight thing without any particular impetus for it. A phobia is an irrational fear of something, like claustrophobia, being so afraid of being in a tube, even though there's plenty of air, that it doesn't make sense to be that afraid. Arachnophobia, being afraid of spiders, whatever.
There's a trypophobia, and it's where you have a fear of seeing open like clusters, like a beehive, a wasp hive, like those type of things, like a lotus pod. Like if you see pictures of it, it looks really disgusting. Like it's gross.
Wow,
It's
huh?
like little holes, like just all together.
Interesting. Hadn't heard of that one. Hadn't heard of that one. Pica is a eating disorder that people, they can't stop eating ice or clay, and some pregnant women, especially in, you know, very rural kind of areas, just would, you know, go through this thing, especially during pregnancy, where they couldn't stop basically eating dirt. But it's a particular kind of clay that seems to induce this.
My mom used to think that it had to do with like a lack of iron or something in your body, and your body's craving that.
Yeah, it's not that clear cut. You know, I mean, you can take an iron supplement and the urge seems to still be there. So, I mean, maybe that kind of initiates it. I don't know. Iron deficiency or something. Yeah, I mean, the clay does have certain minerals in it, but anyway. Post-traumatic stress disorder, a very real condition of people that have been through really traumatic things like, you know, airplane crashes, and they're the only survivor, and you know, certainly soldiers coming back from situations where they were just constantly under threat for their life, and they come back and they just can't get over it, and takes a lot of work to try to get over it and get back to normal. Schizophrenia, again, is something that you diagnose if there are not other causes for your inability to tell what's real from what's not. You know, that things look like what they're not, or you perceive them to be abnormal when they're not, and it there are drugs that help control it, but schizophrenics really have a hard time, again, integrating with society and functioning well. Somatoform disorders, physical symptoms for which there's no obvious physical cause. So it could be a psychogenic problem. You know, I've got this, you know, pain, but you don't have anything wrong with your nerves. I don't care. It's there anyway. Or I'm nauseous all the time. Well, there's nothing wrong with you. I don't care. I'm nauseous all the time. Stress disorder. B. Abbreviations. Plenty of them. Alzheimer, ADHD, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, or atrophic lateral sclerosis, the central nervous system, cerebral palsy, cerebrospinal fluid. A CVA is what they usually call a stroke now, cerebrovascular accident. That's kind of a weird, you know, I mean, a cardiac accident is a heart attack. I don't know. Anyway, that's CVA is used. Electroencephalogram, evoked potentials, lumbar puncture. MRI, we know what that is. MS, we know what that is. And OCD. We're all a little bit OCD. Parkinson, subarachnoid hemorrhage, PTSD, we know that one. You're a right-handed man, emergency department with the right hemiparesis. Expressive aphasia. Now what would that be? Can he understand what you're saying? But he can't, they can't really get the words to come out properly. He may make words because Broca's area is probably working, but they may not make any sense. So he has an expressive inability to form words. No apparent cognitive decline. It seems to be okay otherwise. History of hypertension, had a TI a couple of years ago, negative for a hemorrhage inside. She confirmed the diagnosis of an ischemic stroke. In other words, a blood clot in his brain. So there's a blood clot affecting that speech area. MRI showed it. Caused by a cerebral embolism, a piece of something coming from somewhere and blocking it off. Cerebral thrombosis. You can have atherosclerotic clot. You can have, a fatty blob. You can have a blood clot that is locally produced or one that comes from a deep vein thrombosis. And whatever part of the brain was being nourished is the part that's going to be affected. And they're so good now at knowing which part of the brain does what that they can tell almost, pretty well, unless it's just a massive stroke, which artery was blocked.
So, what again is the difference between the thrombosis and
A thrombosis, by definition, is a blood clot, a thrombus. A thrombus is a blood clot. A thrombosis is a condition caused by a blood clot. But that is, if you form a clot right there and it blocks something, that's a thrombosis. If it forms in your leg and releases and comes somewhere, it's an embolus. It's a thrombic embolus. It's still a blood clot, but it's not because of a damage to that vessel. It's something that formed somewhere else and wound up there.
So thrombosis is in place, and
Embolism is, from somewhere else.
Okay, thank you.
Oops. Encephalomalacia, dissolving of the brain. Probably not a good thing. Myeloradiculitis, inflammation of the nerve roots. You'd have to really know what you're looking at to see that this is inflamed, but maybe it's the swelling here. Glioma. Glial cells growing out of control. Not necessarily cancerous, but the fact that it's benign doesn't mean it can't kill you. It's pushing the ventricles over to the side. It's putting pressure in there. Glioblastoma. Now that's cancerous. Large brain cancer. This person doesn't look like they did so well. Their brain seems to be lying on a table.
And that's the blastoma on the left.
Yeah, this area here. Meningitis is an inflammation of the lining of the brain. Can be bacterial, can be viral. Happens more often in kids who get a lot of ear infections, and that's a pathway inside. Neuroma, a nerve tumor going down to the toes. Poliomyelitis. This could be a potential picture of muscular dystrophy or something too, but because poliomyelitis, the kids that I knew that had it, it mostly affected their legs. It also did in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You know, it was from here down. So it depends on where it happens. If it happens really high, then it's going to affect the arms too. But polio's had a tendency to affect a little bit lower, and usually the people had function of their arms, but their legs maybe not, and the muscles would atrophy terribly. They'd get real skinny. And sometimes when they, at least for a while, they had to go in an iron lung in the days before they used the ventilators they do now to breathe for them because their respiratory muscles were paralyzed.
Is polio another thing that's been mostly eradicated because of vaccines?
Yes. Yeah.
Got a polio vaccine, but it used to be really common, like what, maybe even...
At the time I was born, in 51, polio was a huge deal. They were just coming out with the first vaccines, but in the 40s and early 50s, parents wouldn't let their kids go out in the summer. They wouldn't let them go to the swimming pool because that's when polio was most likely to be contracted. And it was terrible. I mean, it would kill people. It was life-threatening. It would ruin your child's life forever. And they came out first with the shot, and then they came out with the oral vaccine. And I wound up taking both of them. I had one, and then a couple of years later, in our elementary school, everybody, went and got the polio shot. And polio was just like stopped dead in its tracks. It was amazing how effective that was. I don't think it's been eradicated from the world because I think there are still maybe some pockets of it, but I haven't heard for sure about that. And of course, if it hasn't been totally eradicated, people worry that now people don't get vaccines for it anymore. And not only for things like smallpox or polio, which smallpox theoretically has been eradicated. If there's any pocket of it left, though, and suddenly it got brought over, nobody has defense against it, and it could cause a pandemic. Even worse, terrorists could have a little supply of it that they stole from a lab somewhere. Because, scientists will always keep some of it so they have some to study if they ever need it again. And if terrorists got a hold of it and suddenly put it in the water supply or a crop duster and flew over New York City with it or something, they might be able to infect, hundreds of thousands of people or something.
So we're not vaccinated for smallpox anymore? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think people get smallpox vaccinations anymore. Kids. I mean, it was something, I had two of them. I had one on an arm, and a couple of years later I had one on a leg, and it's supposed to last your lifetime. But I don't think they vaccinate kids against smallpox anymore. Yeah, you have to get malaria. There are a lot of things that you have to get. Hepatitis maybe, and but I still don't know if they. Yeah, I still don't know that they do smallpox. I mean, I've traveled a lot, and I've never had to have a smallpox vaccination, and they've never asked me if I already had one. So I don't think it's. I think it is so thoroughly eradicated that people, it's a really small risk of complications to vaccines. It doesn't cause autism. It doesn't cause autism. And it doesn't cause mental problems. But every once in a while, somebody will react as though they actually had the disease, that their immune system is somewhat different. So if there's like zero need for smallpox vaccinations, you're putting people at more risk by giving it to them. If there's still even a modest risk of getting it, it's a lethal disease. It's terrible. So it's better to go ahead and get the vaccine. So that's probably one they don't do anymore.
Yeah, there was a guy in Santa Fe that just got recently diagnosed with the plague.
Yeah, bubonic plague is still around. It's in rats and rabbits and prairie dogs can carry the plague. Don't get bitten by a prairie dog. I've never seen an aggressive prairie dog. run away.
Outside, they'll lay on their back,
Y- right.
all run over. If you look at them, they're all on their back.
Yeah, they're just lying in the sun. Like, you idiot, get out of the street. Subdural hematoma below the dura. Healthy brain. Alzheimer's, you see the brain material is just shrinking. And Alzheimer's brain is half the brain material later in the course of the disease. Lou Gehrig, or ALS, affects almost everything, causes total crippling paralysis, inability to breathe and stuff in a lot of people, except Stephen Hawking, who somehow has managed to survive it for half a century. Cerebral aneurysm, the bulge in the blood vessel. This is cerebral angiography, looking at it, an angiograph. Cerebral palsy, having effects on movement, speech, sometimes cognitive ability. It depends on what happened to the brain. Hydrocephalus, too much water in there. In a baby, it causes the head to expand because the skull isn't fused yet. Multiple sclerosis, again, usually kind of diagnosed by signs and symptoms. If they do full scans, they can maybe see the sclerotic lesions. Parkinson, the shaking, stooped posture, difficulty starting and stopping actions. Secondary Parkinsonism, and this is, we used to call it punch drunk. A lot of old boxers got so they could just barely speak, and they quivered and looked like they had Parkinson's disease. But in fact, it was because their heads had been bashed so many times. And Muhammad Ali was one of the most dramatic examples. He was smart, he was funny, he was witty, he was great, and he was not only a terrific boxer, but a great spokesperson, and he could have been, had a life of being effective, but it got so bad that he could barely do anything. He lit the flame at the Atlanta Olympic Games. I ran the volleyball competition for the Atlanta Olympic Games, and they had Muhammad Ali come and set the torch off, and he walked up there like this. And that was 20-something years ago. He was not terribly old at the time. Sciatica. The sciatic nerve comes out of the lumbar sacral area here and goes down the back of the leg. Herpes zoster. Here it is going along the path of a intercostal nerve or a couple of intercostal nerves. Shingles. Subarachnoid hematoma below the little arachnoid layer. Intracerebral means it's inside the brain. There's a good angiograph. Electroencephalogram. That's a pretty thorough one. I don't think I've ever seen that many electrodes. My BioPac system does EEG, and so whenever we're doing A&P1 and we get to that neural lab at the end, if there's anybody in class that shaves their head, I do an EEG, because you have to shave the spot to do it, and I don't ask somebody to shave their head for me. But several times we've had somebody who shaved their head, or one time one of the students brought in her husband who shaved his head, so he got to see his brain waves. CT of the brain. MRI, more clear. Alzheimer, activity in the normal brain, activity in the Alzheimer brain. Evoked potentials, seeing how she can respond to auditory stimuli. We did a really neat hyperbaric study using this and a reaction time to see if people under hyperbaric oxygen conditions had the same reactions, reflexes, as those that didn't. And in fact, their reflexes were slightly slower. We were trying to see if there was a reason why divers needed to be more aware because their reactions might be slower. It was only slower by a few hundredths of a second. But it was the same amount slower as a person who's had a few drinks. So it was, you know, it didn't look like it was significant, but it kind of was. Okay, computer time.